All right, so this is going to be some great info today. This is how to go 100% animal based and what that actually means. Um, you know, we've had, depending on where you're at in this progression and when you're watching this, we've had several meetings leading up to this. Now, if you want to look, feel, and perform your best, at some point you've got to do something that looks like an elimination diet, and animal based is the ultimate elimination diet. But the problem is that a lot of people would jump into something like this and try to go full force, and it just wouldn't serve them well. Like they'd have a really, really hard time with it. So just like many things that we do, this animal based progression has been progression based, which is basically easing us into it. So we started with the base of this flexible animal based omnivore food pyramid, the superfoods, the animal foods, the healthful fats, and then we also allowed some of the plants. And at that first meeting, we basically eliminated hardy vegetables, the nightshades, which tend to be one of the most problematic categories of plants, and then nuts, seeds, and legumes. So we had a lot of flexibility, and I think that was a really, really good start for a lot of people. Then we moved into our second phase, and that was when we focused mainly on plants that were what we consider to be the least toxic plants, and that is our safe starches, fruits, and squash. Everything else still in the deal, but we got rid of a lot of plants at that point. So let's talk about what 100% animal based means to us. Let's start with the what up front. So what this means to us is basically 100% animal foods, almost no plants. I'm going to make just a couple exceptions to just make this livable in the modern lifestyle. But here you see in our food pyramid, we're getting rid of the fermented foods, unless it's fermented animal foods, that would be totally fine. And we're getting rid of the fatty fruits, and it's 100% animal based. It doesn't mean it's zero carb because we've got some honey in the deal. So again, our first phase was basically no hardy vegetables, no nightshades, no nuts, seeds, or legumes. Our second phase was moving to only safe starches, fruit, and squashes. Now we're coming into our 100% animal based phase. And then we're going to learn how to reintroduce and self test. Now, each one of these phases, depending on if you're attending live or if you're watching this after the fact, ideally you'd spend more than a week in each phase. You want to spend enough time in each phase that you feel like you've kind of settled into a groove and you're not going through any adjustments. 2 weeks at a minimum, 4 weeks might be even better. But even doing it a week at a time for each phase, you're going to learn something about yourself. So each of these meetings, we have some plant restrictions, superfoods focus, and then we also have some guidelines around full fat dairy and liquids. So here in this third phase, which is going into 100% animal based, we're going to eliminate dairy. And I'll tell you why, even though dairy is animal based. And then we're also going to take out some of the liquids like the flavored waters and flavored sparkling waters and alcohol. I'm leaving coffee and tea in here just because it's just such an ingrained part of a lot of our lives. And some people, when they go off of coffee, like because of the caffeine piece of it, they feel really crappy. I think that's subjective. If you're really doing this 100%, you would eliminate coffee and tea as well. So I think that's just one area that I'm willing to be a little bit flexible, because what we're trying to get out of this is we're trying to learn which plants we do best on. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't know that coffee and tea are problematic as far as that's concerned, but coffee and tea could be problematic for other reasons, like adrenal dysfunction, maybe having too much caffeine. So let's get into the why. And I think this is great. And it's also a really great segue to our last meeting that's going to be on interpreting symptoms and self-testing. So we've heard this many times before. We always want to be going without something so that we can develop a honed intuition about what's good for our body. We always want to be going without something so that we can reintroduce that thing that we've been without. Well, first of all, so that we can see how we feel without it. And then so that we can reintroduce that thing to see how we react once we bring it back in. That is the way that we hone our intuition. It's the way that we figure out, what is the best way of eating for myself? And that changes as time goes on. So this is out of the guide, out of our newest guide. I'm just going to read this in the honed intuition section. Over time, we want a big part of our real food nutrition to be intuitive. As we continue to develop and perfect our personalized way of eating, we should develop a honed intuition about what is good for us. We start to pick up on feedback from our body that we weren't used to before. These signals can tell us if we're on the right track or if something needs to change. And so there's some things that we need to develop a honed intuition. One thing that I do want to just make a plug for here, and this is also in the guide, is being consistent with your health habits as you're doing these experiments, because you want a consistent background as you're making these, kind of individual finite and minute changes. Because if I'm not consistent with my health habits and I throw other things into the mix, it's kind of difficult to know what's contributing to the way that I'm feeling. Okay. So, and probably speaking to the choir here, I know that most of us have very consistent health habits, but we want to make sure that to the best of our abilities, the rest of our life is relatively consistent. Our sleep patterns are relatively consistent, our workout patterns, our timing of meals and things like that, so that we're not going through an adjustment based on the lifestyle factors or the timing of things, and we can really focus on the thing that we're eliminating and or reintroducing. I think this is also a really good time to talk about autoimmune. So most of us are probably familiar or have heard the term autoimmune. I have a lot of clients that I work with that come to me and they have autoimmune, and sometimes that clears itself up just by going through the things that we go through as we through the health coaching process. Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. So I just wanted to address what this actually is. So, we have some talks on the immune system. We have one called natural immunity, which is the most recent one that we did this past year. Is really, really solid, and we go into more detail about this. But we have a couple of different types of parts of our immune system. One is the innate immunity. It's not memory based, but it is very fast acting. So you can think about your body having like little patrol cars that are always on the move. They're always going around looking for things, and they deal with issues and invaders as they happen. And they use things like acute inflammation to deal with an insult. Okay, so this is why, with innate immunity, we're getting swelling, heat, sometimes pain can be a sign of inflammation. We also have what's known as the adaptive acquired immunity, and this has a memory. This is very intelligent, but it's not as fast acting because you have to build up an antibody or some kind of defense against this pathogen. So it also uses inflammation to isolate and deal with these pathogens, but the reaction is targeted to a specific intruder. And so the inflammation flares up only when the antibody has detected this particular threat, and it remembers that in the future. And the reason that I bring that up is, well, first of all, there's a lot of symptoms that could be autoimmune related. Not always, but this is just something to consider as you move forward with things. A lot of us may have like a low level autoimmune situation, like arthritis is almost always autoimmune based to some degree. But I've got a list of symptoms here. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can pause the video or just glance through this real quick and see if anything resonates with you. If you have any questions, jot it down. And then at the bottom there, we got some statistics. Now, this was pulled from the autoimmune solution, and so the statistics are probably like 2019 or something like that. So probably higher than this, but we've got like just an incredible amount of autoimmune condition diagnoses, and then there's probably a lot that have been underdiagnosed. So for autoimmune, for something to be considered autoimmune, you have to have a few things in place. The first one is, we call this the autoimmune trifecta. You have to have a genetic predisposition, which means that you have to have this predisposition to have it manifest, but it doesn't mean that it's going to manifest. Okay, if you don't have the predisposition, then it would never manifest. But then you also have to have a trigger. Now, the trigger is what we talked about just a minute ago, where the body builds up an antibody against this trigger. Okay, so this trigger is the insult that comes into our system, and this trigger is typically a protein and or something that's plant-based, unfortunately. So even with those things in place, you have a genetic predisposition, you have a trigger, the body has to see the trigger. And so that trigger has to cross the intestinal barrier. And so this is where leaky gut permeability comes into play, because if you have leaky gut or gut permeability, then that's what's allowing this trigger to cross the digestive system barrier. And so even if you have a genetic predisposition, and even if you have this trigger, if you have a really strong digestion, then it's very challenging for you to manifest symptoms based on an autoimmune condition. Okay, that doesn't mean that you're not going to feel off or something from something that's not appropriate for you, but the stronger your digestion, the better. That's one of the key takeaways there. So again, the reason that we want to consider doing something like 100% animal based is because a lot of us have digestive issues. still, even within being in real food, we have skin issues, we have maybe autoimmune symptoms, and symptoms are your body's way of communicating with you that something's not right, something's off. I think a lot of us need to hear that because we don't realize that sometimes, when you don't feel great and you got again, you're consistent with your routine and your sleep is on point, you're getting sun most days and working out most days, like with those things being consistent, if you have something popping up that doesn't feel right, then that's your body trying to tell you something. And if I tried to categorize symptoms into categories, then it would be digestion, skin, energy, and mood tend to be some really, really good indicators. So I'm just going to go through some ones that I think are relevant to an animal-based progression. These are things that we would see kind of manifest if you're responding to plants, in a inappropriate way. So like skin issues, 100% for sure. This is an indication of weak digestion. It could be a plant anti-nutrient. It could be some other kind of food intolerance. It could be a dairy intolerance. Other things like binge eating or uncontrolled eating. A lot of times we attribute this to some digestive dysfunction because your body's not getting all the nutrition that it needs from the foods that you're eating. We also would equate this to maybe some blood sugar dysregulation. So as you have these spikes and crashes of blood sugar, your body's kind of fighting for some energy that makes you kind of crave some things. But then also plant toxins can do this. A lot of people don't realize that, but gliadin, a property of gluten, is it's the reason why wheat is put in almost every processed food product because it stimulates the appetite. If you awaken a few hours after falling asleep and it's hard to get back to sleep, a lot of times, again, we would maybe attribute this to blood sugar dysregulation, could be some stress issues, but it could also be a plant toxin that's messing with your body. Constipation, very, very common as we transition into a real food way of eating, or if we're adjusting to low carbs or lower carbs. Sometimes it could be attributed to dehydration. Majority of the time, which is why I'm such a big fan of our digestive support trio, low stomach acid, some pancreatic insufficiency, which basically means enzyme insufficiency, and then biliary stasis, meaning you don't have really good bile flow. And again, this is why I like to support those three areas with digestive support. But also dairy intolerance can be an issue here. I see a lot of people, especially women, when they pull dairy out, especially, and we're not talking about butter, but we're talking about cheeses and yogurts and things like that. They pull dairy out, their digestive system cleans up really fast. Super fascinating. Your pulse speeding after eating. So this may be an indication that your body doesn't like something that you consumed. Okay, so you have some kind of a substance sensitivity, and it could be a plant toxin. By the way, I think pulse is just one of the best things that you can monitor on a consistent basis. Like I love to take my pulse. Undigested food and stool. Digestive dysfunction. So if you have low stomach acid, you're not breaking things down to the degree that you need to. Pancreatic insufficiency. Again, this is basically saying you don't secrete the enzymes that you should or in the amounts that you should. Also not chewing your food well. So this is a plug for your stomach does not have teeth. And so the better you chew your food, the easier it is on your digestive system. But then also undigested food and stool could be some plant toxins that your body's trying to get rid of. Belching, gas, bloat, excessive fullness after meals, again, low stomach acid, low enzyme activity, substance intolerance, and then sometimes a plant toxin, right, contributing to digestive dysfunction. And then in my experience, I had the gamut of freaking digestive issues. And even as I've been doing this for a really long time, like my digestion never got as consistent as it has recently when I've simplified my diet and basically, I eat animal-based plus fruit starch and some things that I know that I tolerate. Also, my indicators, I had skin issues. I had this little patch of eczema that would crack and almost bleed sometimes. It was on my foot and figured out it was a wheat sensitivity, which is almost like a no duh. I'm teaching like people not to eat wheat, but we allowed beer here and there. I literally would have like a pint of beer once a week or something like that with the guys out camping or something. And even the gluten reduced beers would contribute to that. And when I took that out, completely cleared up. Then I would have these little itchy patches that showed up on the back of my knees. It was so bizarre. And somebody that I worked out with in the gym had the same reaction to the same thing. We finally narrowed it down to cassava. Cassava is touted as one of these safer alternatives to the wheat-based like flours and pastas and chips and things like that. It's what's the dominant part of the siete chips and the siete products. But I can't tolerate those things. I can't have the siete tortillas or the chips or anything because I get these little itchy patches that pop up. So even within the realm of what we consider to be safe for most people, it may not be safe for you. Okay. That's my point. And I've pulled this info from a lot of different sources and I continue to learn about it. I continue to work with clients and my insights and my wisdom about this really, really get strong. So even though you may have seen this before, just keep in mind what are the main things that are suspect within our way of eating, right? These are things that we would otherwise say that are totally fine. Full fat dairy, any and all seeds, even though we're okay with like hard shelled nuts and properly prepared legumes, egg whites or the entire egg. There's some anti-nutrients in both. The majority of people that are sensitive to eggs are sensitive to the whites, but some people are also sensitive to the yolks. Nightshades, we're already eliminating nightshades, but nightshades are the other family of plants that have these toxins that in most nightshades are extremely poisonous, but nightshades that we've kind of hybridized to make edible, they still have some remnants of those things and some people are sensitive to them. And then just plants in general. I mean, there's just so many things in plants that could be messing with people and it's just really hard to tell. And that's why we want to do this progression. Now, when it comes to full fat dairy, dairy is animal based, but dairy for some people is a problem. And if we look at the spectrum of how dairy is created, we start with milk, and then depending on how we ferment it or we inoculate it with some beneficial microorganisms, we can get cheese, we can get yogurt. If we take the cream off the dairy, then that's what we call heavy whipping cream or heavy cream. If we ferment the cream, that turns into sour cream. And then butter would be the coagulated cream, and then ghee would be butter with all the milk solids removed. And it's actually certified dairy free. Now, what's problematic about that is that, first of all, when it starts as milk in its totality, theoretically, it has the most potential problematic things. And as we move down this progression, because of the fermentation process and because we're isolating the fat, it tends to be least problematic. But the things that are problematic about it are going to be, for some people, not everybody, for some people it can be very insulinogenic or very blood sugar spiking. Okay, the lactose, some people just react very poorly to it. Some people have a casein intolerance. Sometimes it's a type of casein, depending on the type of cow. There's difference between the casein found in A1 milk versus A2 milk. It could be a lactose intolerance. It could be a sensitivity to whey. It could be a sensitivity to phytic acid. So there's a lot of things in dairy that could be problematic. And it's just interesting that even though dairy is animal based, it potentially has these problems. But what I believe is that the animals that we get this dairy from are consuming a ton of plants, and dairy or milk is the first thing that comes out of that process. And so it probably has a potential to have more things in it that are going to make us sensitive. Whereas if we eat the flesh of the animal, that's after everything has been detoxified out of the plants. And we've converted the plants into flesh. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but so if we look at our guidelines here, this is why we're going to eliminate. I highly recommend eliminating dairy except for butter, because most people do totally fine on butter, but you could take butter out too and just use ghee or just animal fats, which would be great. So basically we're doing all animal foods, butter and ghee and the animal fats. We're not doing full fat dairy like cheese, yogurts, and creams. We're eliminating all plants. And then we have our superfoods. I would love for everyone to get into the habit of bone stock most days, multi-collagen most days, raw unpasteurized honey most days. Bone marrow, I try to have every day. Sometimes I'll run out of it and then I'll go for a little bit without it until I can find some. But bone marrow was a superfood project that we recommended last time we got together. And then a quarter pound of liver weekly would be ideal. But if these are new things to you, just doing it for the first time and just getting a feel for it would be a really big win. Okay. For liquids, again, to reiterate, clean water, sparkling water, as long as it's the unflavored versions. I'm going to allow coffee and tea for those of us that are completely habituated to it. And if we pulled that out, we'd have a confounding variable there. Like we were talking about keeping things consistent. Although if you were really doing 100% animal based, you would eliminate those things too. And if you want to, you can. I'm highly considering it because I have a super low caffeine version of coffee, and I don't think that's going to be a problem. So, and then we're getting rid of LaCroix and things like that because they have, some flavors and some plant-based stuff in it. So I think if you've been following us in this progression up to this point, this is going to be super doable, super fascinating, And I think you're going to enjoy it. Like most of us really enjoyed this phase. And I, just to put a plug in there for getting excited about the next meeting and getting excited about finding out what are your triggers. Um, that's the ultimate goal of this, right? So if we can do this for a week, see what happens, get some feedback from it, and then have this intention to, it's not going to last forever, just like everything that we do. We're going to bring these things back in just to see, how we feel with it. So next meeting, we're going to talk about interpreting symptoms and subjective markers. We're going to talk about some self-testing techniques. And we've got several different things that we can use there. I mean, I've already alluded to the pulse as being a great one, but there's a bunch of other things that we can use. And we'll talk about self-testing, and it's going to be freaking awesome.